English. She's known for her incisive reporting across Africa. She has covered many major events from the Libyan revolution to student protests in South Africa, and has interviewed leaders like Paul Kagame and Thabo Mbeki. Thank you for joining us, Famida. And then we have Dr. Ziad Mayet. He is an orthopedic surgeon based here in Johannesburg, specializing in ankle, foot, and limb reconstructive surgery. He's also associated with Gift of the Givers, and Dr. Ziad Mayet has also been a part of several outreach missions to assist with medical care, most notably in 2014 when he himself worked in Gaza following a major conflict. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let me get you the second mic. So I'm sorry, you guys will have to share that mic if that's all right, since we only have the two to work with. So, given what we've just witnessed, how do you guys feel about the siege, the gravity, the impact on both the population and then journalists and healthcare workers depicted?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it was a heavy watch. It's a killer. That was a walk right down memory lane. Everything just started coming back. It's yeah, and I think, I don't know, it's just, I'm lost. I have no words.
Famida?
I think documenting what's happened over the last 19 months, the war, but specifically what we can see is a genocide. We're reminded of that through what these filmmakers have done, in that they've humanized. There comes a point where you watch a genocide, you watch a war, and it becomes numbers, 50,000, and you don't recognize what exactly is happening because it's normalized and you're desensitized. But these two films humanize, give names to each and every person, and relating to the journalists specifically, we got to know the three of them, or even the healthcare workers. We got to know them, their story, and through that, we're reminded of what people, human beings just like us, what they're going through, and why it matters to document the atrocities that are occurring thousands of kilometers away, that we can detach ourselves from. And then something like this reminds us that, no, you don't detach, and it's the awareness is important. The continued attention on what's happening is vital. And that's why something like this, the documentation, is vital.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's very difficult to actually take in what the documentaries capture. But I think it does demonstrate the importance of witnessing, of what we do with this horror that we're living in. It's under our watch that this is taking place. And I think, while I was reflecting on what I would preparing for this, there were statistics from Reporters Without Borders, and what it amounts to is 12 journalists a day within a period of 18 months was killed by the IDF. And that can be nothing targeted to prevent the world from witnessing what is taking place. So it does give respect to what journalists are doing and the risks they have to take when they should not be a target. If we had laws that were respected, humanitarian laws.
And journalists are protected under international law. So, I mean, from your perspective, Sharon, as someone with Lawyers for Human Rights, what are your views on the impact of these legal breaches in international law?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I work at Lawyers for Rights, and I'm an activist. But I think that just as an activist and also reflecting today, I think, it reflects on the failure of the UN system. What we're witnessing here, what we see on a daily basis, the protests globally, the solidarity against this genocide, and we said never again after the Rwandan genocide. We said never again after Myanmar, and yet it's happening in our watch. And I think that that's the most. There's no word for it.
It's
actually.
jarring.
Yeah,
It's jarring.
Yeah.
There's a sense of failure, I think. Yeah. I have one more question for you, Sharon, and then I'm going to come to you, Famida. But Sharon, as someone in the activist space, and I see you as a humanitarian, I'm sure that you would agree. What is it that ties South African together with Palestine? What is the thing that binds us so closely to Palestine?
So I think, it's also something I was reflecting on how the trauma that's triggered in us, some of us who were activists during the struggle against apartheid, the repression of the racist apartheid regime. And I think that the solidarity of that shared history of struggle, of repression, of racism, but also knowing the role that capitalism plays in this, in benefiting from this, and I want to speak a bit more about that later. But I think that as activists, we've got to understand who's profiteering from this war and in whose interest is it, and the role of the United States, the role of global multi-tech companies benefiting from killing and having blood on their hands.
And I suppose that's a unifying factor across many struggles globally, from South Africa to Palestine to Sudan and Congo, is that there's almost an element of exploitation. There's someone who benefits from it. And then from your perspective, Famida, given that you have so much insight on global strife and conflicts around the world, what about Palestine would you say sets it apart?
I think the intensity of what has happened over these many months, but speaking as a journalist, I think what is especially difficult to grasp is that it's never ending for the people there, the journalists on the ground. It's a lived experience in a way that, I hope I never have the opportunity to experience. If I'm deployed to a hostile environment, it's for a week, it's for 10 days, it's done on rotation. You get to leave. And the journalists in Gaza don't have that. Any of the people in that situation don't have that option. And as journalists specifically, they have to work in that environment with very difficult challenges in terms of their work, that they don't have access to, perhaps where the story is, if you call it that. Even driving from one place to another, there's the risk of shelling, of gunfire. They're prevented from accessing and documenting areas that, where there is an airstrike, for example. So there are the practical considerations, even around the documentation, the equipment that they use, not having the parts to replace things that they need, not having internet, not having signal on their cell phones. And we saw that in what we watched earlier. And yet they remain determined, devoted. And then there's the personal impact. We've seen journalists who have lost entire families, colleagues. I remember on Al Jazeera specifically, there's a correspondent, Hind Khudari, who had a live crossing just after the killing of a colleague, Ismail Al-Ghul. And she struggled to contain herself. She was near tears throughout that live crossing because she had to do her job. But she was talking about a colleague, somebody she had spoken to just hours before. They were talking about trying to get aid, I think it was to a part of Gaza that was inaccessible, and trying to work out how to help people. And then she heard the news of him being killed, and he had been separated from his own family throughout that time. How do you do a job that is very important, disassociate from what's happening around you, the separation from your loved ones, and just continue. And watching her ultimately feeling devastated by what had just happened, but having to continue. And then the presenter that day, had the foresight to release her at some point, because he could see that it's just too much. You have that kind of empathy, in that it's almost a reliving it, and trying to accept what has just happened. It's a sort of torture of its own. And he released her from that live crossing after a couple of questions, because it was intense, it was devastating. And I think, to answer your question, this and so much more is what separates what is happening in Gaza from all. It doesn't diminish other war zones, other areas of conflict or hostility, but this genocide is deeply, deeply intense, and it's relentless. And it's senseless. And I think that's what also frustrates people, and the levels of psychological warfare that we've seen. I think it's very difficult for anyone trying to do anything there and being on the ground. I think that is what separates it from from other areas of conflict, but also the lack of accountability. It's unending. There's no reason. It just doesn't stop. And the hopelessness,
And the
perhaps,
blatant targeting.
the blatant targeting.
Blatant targeting.
We've had more than 200 journalists targeted up to this point, deliberately targeted. Ismail was one of them, and there are many others. There is no safe. It's just unrelenting.
No, I hear you. And deeply traumatic.
Deeply
And
traumatic.
you speak about the mental impact of being on the ground, working on the ground. I suppose it applies to healthcare workers and journalists being on the front line, both targeted and seeing your own loved ones sometimes be lost along the way. And Dr. Ziad Mayet, if you could perhaps comment on your experience on the ground. What was it like for you working under truly, truly difficult conditions in Gaza, the mental impact that you both had and saw?
Yeah. The thing is, at the time, you ran on adrenaline, you ran on whatever was coming your way. You kept doing what you needed to do. It was really afterwards. And I could step away from it. I could have that time to decompress and debrief and go through all of those things. There was a little shoe on a mound of rubble that I'd seen there, and that just caught me. My son was about that age. He could have worn that shoe. We saw the clothes on the video. These are people's lives. This is what's going on, and I can walk away. They can't. It's there. It's unrelenting. It's unforgiving. It's just ongoing.
And the scale of damage, because I mean, if you're working under tightly resourced conditions and you are under so much mental strain, you're working with a deeply traumatized population mentally and physically. How do you help them under those conditions? Were the resources tight when you were there as well?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have the switch as a medical doctor, as a surgeon. You switch off, you turn off the emotions, you turn everything down. It's about the work. It's about getting through. It's about doing what you need to do. The equipment, there was lots of problems around that. The equipment that we had flown in had never got to us. We had to use what they were using. That was suture material that was lying on the runway for who knows how long. And when it finally gets into the hospital, you're using it and it just crumbles in your hand. Things like that, orthopedic implants and things that you would put onto broken bones. We saw in the video, there was the lady with the external fixator on her leg. That's something that belongs in the archives. That's something from the 1980s, 1970s. And, you just make do with what you've got. You just keep going.
And then you have to also consider, I suppose, not only do you have inadequate materials and you yourself are far strained in terms of providing the service, you're also working with a population that is profoundly malnourished. And that really impedes on wound healing. And that I imagine would be greatly worsened by the fact that Israel's imposed a true severe blockade since the 2nd of March, not allowing any food, water, medical equipment in since that time. That's 73 days now. So while I still have you, Dr. Mayat, how do you rehabilitate a population that is so damaged? And then I'm coming to you, Famida.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is simple, really, or really very unsimple. Stop the war. There's nothing that's much else. That's where it starts. That's where the healing starts. And you've got to end that, and then start looking at other things. I mean, how do we get the nutrition up? How do we get the orthopedic implants in? That's all secondary. It's really stop the war.
Right, and it's a long road ahead after that. Famida, from your experience, how is the journalism space responding to what's happening to your colleagues on the ground, first of all? And then second of all, what is your experience of censorship or pressure to refrain from reporting on the issue?
I want to start with the latter. And I think in terms of the censorship, we're seeing that coming from the occupier in terms of the targeted killings of journalists. The censorship is implemented through targeted killings because the truth is not able to get out. And I think that's one of the major instruments in terms of awareness. And perhaps that is almost circumvented to some extent with perhaps what was viewed as citizen journalism, where we've got very prominent through this war people who have come out using their cell phones, using the internet, taking on roles that perhaps they didn't have before, coming to the fore to bring the truth out. And I think that is what is related to people out there, that this is somebody that they can relate to. This is an everyday person. Many of them are journalists, but in terms of using the very basic equipment that they have available and sacrificing, making sacrifices to bring the truth out. And so I think the censorship, in fact, has been limited because of things like social media and the devotion people have to telling these stories and creating awareness. And this has been very important, I think, especially in the West. Audiences or populations who were accepting of a certain narrative because these stories weren't out there. And perhaps we didn't see warfare to this extent and how deeply people have been impacted. And people have essentially been re-educated because of this citizen journalism, because of social media, because they're exposed to far more than they have ever before. They're not relying on Western controlled media, traditional media, to tell stories that are perhaps have a bias, a political agenda, and backed by specific governments. That's dealing with the censorship. And in terms of how we respond to what's happening, I think it's unfortunately determined by where you come from and who you're broadcasting from or writing for. Thankfully, we've seen some traditional media outlets, because of the pressure they've faced, have to reassess how they deal with Gaza. But it took a very long time. I think they were very reluctant, but they couldn't avoid that pressure. And even there's a long way to go in terms of how these stories are covered, but they've been forced to look at the alternative. I think it's also made us reassess what our own bias, what the ideas are around balance, because there comes a point where there isn't balance in the traditional sense. There's just the truth. And so we've had to, and I think most importantly is it's been a reminder of our role as journalists and what that means in terms of being a voice for the voiceless, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, speaking for people who can't otherwise. And again, it goes back to this issue of awareness. So I think we've had to reassess a number of things in terms of how we cover news. Also, the instruments we use to cover news. It's not going to be as slick as it once was, right? Nicely packaged.
It's almost like the journalists on the ground face the same issue as the healthcare workers, which is not the right equipment and a lack of means. But I suppose that's how we overcome the capitalism and the extortion, everything that drives us. The people who are in power have much greater means, financially perhaps, but how the people on the ground have overcome that is through passion. And I think that's what we can do as well in terms of advocacy, in terms of raising awareness, in terms of keeping the momentum of the movement going to help the Palestinian people, is that we need to lean on our passion. I want to come to you for a closing point, Sharon, because I know that you wanted to make a point on this especially, and then we'll conclude.
Okay, so I'm sure many of you have seen this book, and Al Jazeera is actually running a documentary on it, Palestine, the Laboratory. And what we know is that Israel is at the forefront of the so-called global terror, the war, global terror war. And I think that it's these reasons that have made the UN as a structure impotent in taking action, because the states that make up this body is relying on Israel to fight against these so-called terrorists, the Islamophobia, the xenophobia that's being spread across the world. But I think in all of that, there's also Google, there's Amazon, there's Microsoft, and we need to be having the owners of these bodies. It's, the names of the owners. Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, Bill Gates, with blood on their hands, because they're making profits out of killing. They've a sleek, well-oiled, technical. They're building the software, and this is what's making excessive profits. It's the same with supporting Russia in the what's happening with the Ukraine. So it's a global thing, and we know that Israel supported Pinochet in Chile. They sent arms to the Rwandan genocide to support the Houthis. So I think that it's key what you're saying is that we've got to expose who is really keeping up this war, and it's got to stop. But you've got to expose who's benefiting out of it.
And they were tied to apartheid South Africa.
That's right.
Right.
So it's the
Sorry to interrupt. Sure, we ran out of time.
Sure.
We're going to take the discussion outside. There's another movie artist. Sorry, I'm the bearer of injuries. I'm the shipwreck keeper, and we have to make our way out. So we're just sitting in the back. We'll take the discussion outside.
But everyone, as you're going, there are stickers on the table as you're on your way out. There are these lovely little